Hello and welcome to the Change Gang podcast with me, your host, Laura Ordile. I'm here to help you hold on to your sanity and your soul as you move through big change in your life. I'm here to guide you, inform you, and hopefully help you to triumph over trauma and the long list of symptoms that come along with it. This podcast series is to bring knowledge, share stories, and open up conversation around hope for those of you that suffer with the difficulties that present themselves in your life, from diagnosed or undiagnosed trauma. Labeled or not, I know you need help, and so do those that have graciously taken the time to have these conversations with me. So let's get to it. Welcome to the Week Change Gang. I'm super excited as we continue this series in trauma, and I get to talk with the person that really has shown me so much about it, Sarah Yuen. Sarah's here today, and she is going to talk with us all about PTSD, CPTSD, trauma in general, all of those fun things that we get to talk about in this. But I say fun things in the way that it's not so fun if you're experiencing the difficulty that comes along with that. And oftentimes people who have something going on don't realize there's more to it because they're just simply experiencing a symptom, one thing or another thing, and then maybe a couple more, but they don't realize it's all connected. And Sarah really helped me realize that it is connected. There's so much of it that's connected. And she's had her own journey, so I'm going to ask a little bit about that to begin with, Sarah. Why did you start to work with people in the trauma area? I know you had a little bit of your own situation that went on, so if you can share about that.
Well, I'm not a normal therapist. I haven't been doing it for years and years, and it wasn't my main career. I am a television reporter at heart. I was a TV reporter from 17. And over the years, I started to not so much specialise, but was lucky enough to cover events worldwide. And that included a lot of disasters and conflicts and traumatic situations. And when you're a journalist, you're a little bit removed from it. You're obviously behind the camera. It makes you once removed. And then you've got to try to present an overview of what's happening. So again, you're twice removed in that respect. And I think as the years went by, it became difficult to remove yourself from a situation. And I was the reporter who was always there, yes, wanting to interview people, yes, wanting to take the pictures, but then I'd be round the back handing out food and giving people a hug, and it would stick with me, these people's faces and the pain that they were suffering. And actually over time, what really worried me was that I didn't feel anything. And I guess that was just the body's natural defense to try to insulate you against what you were seeing. And a lot of people saw a lot more than I did, but even the bits that I saw in Africa and in different earthquakes and tsunamis and disasters was enough for one day to make me look down on some bodies that were floating in the water in the Philippines in 2013 and feel nothing and think, why don't I feel anything? Maybe I should worry about this. And it wasn't particularly affecting me at the time in terms of my general happiness. I'm a pretty happy person, a pretty easygoing person. But I did find that my levels of snappiness increased and that I couldn't tolerate certain things if they said things about, other people being hurt, that they didn't care that other people were being hurt or they were supporting people being hurt or killed. My snappiness certainly kicked in. And before that incident in Taliban, I'd been in a situation where I went to Afghanistan for 2 years. I was taken by the British military to be an advisor, and I thought that I'd be sitting in an office somewhere advising them on how to deal with media issues. But I ended up being in combat, and I ended up being embedded with troops as a help to them as to how to deal with the media when they were in awful situations, and found myself at 45 running at compounds and dodging gunfire and vehicles being blown up around me. Everything in my career seemed to be pushing me towards something that was much more spiritual. I'm a very spiritual person anyway, but towards something that was far more, I need to do something rather than just stick a camera in people's faces. And perhaps I just needed to do that for me too, because I wasn't happy that we would go to places film the hell out of it, interview everyone and then say bye and walk off. And I worry about some of my journalistic friends who probably feel the same way as me, but aren't quite sure that they wish to acknowledge it. So I felt myself being pushed more and more. Most of my life I've been pushed to do something. One day I'll wake up and there's a voice in my head saying, do that. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so I felt I needed to do something psychological. And I'd always been interested in hypnotherapy. I'd done many television programs on hypnotherapy, fascinated by it, fascinated by Brian Weiss and past life regression. And so I decided, I thought I'll be a psychologist. And then I realized I don't really agree with a lot of psychology. I don't agree that you've got something wrong with you. This is the symptom. Okay, well, name your diagnosis, your symptom, and there you're done. And this hasn't achieved anything. It hasn't taken away the symptom, hasn't taken away the feelings. It's just, we put a label on it now, so now you'll be all right. And I thought, if I go into a psychology class, I'm just going to start causing havoc. And then I thought, well, hypnotherapy. I actually woke up one morning and this voice was going, hypnotherapy. And so I thought, okay, I'll learn that. So over the course of, I went to Canada to learn it. I was living in Thailand, so I used to commute to Canada for the residencies, and then I was learning online. And over the course of that study for a year in Canada with Arch, I came across an awful lot of works about how much hypnotherapy was being used for treating PTSD. And a lot of my friends who'd been with me in Afghanistan in 2010, 2011 were beginning to suffer a little bit. They were beginning to have a few issues over things that were done there and things they'd experienced there, and were coming to me saying, do you feel the same way? And I was thinking, well, no, not really. But, I am a bit angry. At the time, I didn't put two and two together that anger and irritability is actually a symptom of overload and traumatic overload. And I just thought, I'm just getting older, snappy, miserable. I started studying the work of a chap called John Watkins, who was a American psychiatrist in World War II, who was given the worst of the cases coming back from the European front to try to see if he could get them out of the things that they were experiencing, because nothing else was working. They tried, normal therapy, normal psychotherapy, play therapy, art therapy, horse therapy. They tried everything, and then in the end they were on sodium pentothal drug, where they were trying to inject them to get them to talk because they wouldn't talk otherwise. And the more I read about what he had done in World War II, the more I realized I could help these people who I'd been with in Afghanistan. And in a way, I was like specializing before I was trained, because I peppered my poor instructor with things about PTSD, which he actually wasn't an expert in himself. But I was like soaking up all this information. And over the course of studying that, I realized that, I need work on me. I've kind of barreled through life like a battering ram. And I realized that I needed to stop for a bit and think that, this irritability is not okay. You've got to get rid of that. And family issues are not okay. You've got to deal with the things in your past.
Right. And so you went in and you did that for yourself.
I did that later, actually, way after I'd started practicing, because as I was practicing and I was dealing with people and they were saying, I feel like this or feel like this, I was like, yeah, me too. But I'm not saying that, but I'm thinking, oh my Lord, I feel exactly the same way you do. And also the one thing that really stuck out in all the research I was doing was something actually that Freud noted way back at the beginning of this last century, and was that the root was coming from childhood. So even though people had gone to war and experienced the most awful circumstances and been tested morally in a horrible way, the people who were developing the symptoms that we would now see as PTSD, a whole gamut of them, were people who had struggled from the very beginning of their lives. And it's always, the dichotomy has always interested me, that you would think that if someone had a really tough life and had to look after themselves really early on and had gone up through life, battling really, they'd be the most resilient. But they're not. It's a question of physics. The more you put on top of someone, in the end, that weight will break something. And the person who's had a very easy life and lovely, loving parents and happy brothers and sisters and got what they needed in life, met someone lovely, got married, they have more resilience than the people who've been struggling from the very beginning. And a lot of people argue against me on that and say, that can't be true. But it is. And as I say, it's not PTSD, it's physics. It's simply the end. One straw will break the camel's back. And I'd had a very difficult childhood, and I'd certainly got what I call like paving slabs on top of paving slabs of trauma and upset and bad treatment. And I realized that was coming out through me, and it was coming out through my clients. And now my practice is very much, come in, tell me how you're feeling, what's going on in your life. But very quickly we'll start to look back through their lives just to see, is this a person who's really fought for survival, fought for existence, and maybe just fought to have the right to be heard, and lived in a situation that's very terrifying or fearful. And all those things that we couldn't address when we were little just get shoved in a big box. And then when the box is full, there's no getting that lid back on, which is why you can't escape these feelings. You can't sit there thinking, oh, maybe they'll disappear. And I realized that it was coming out in every aspect of my life. I was angry about my childhood. I was as angry about my childhood as I was angry about the mistreatment of people in Afghanistan, and it was like everything was interlinking. If you acted in an unjust fashion around me, I could explode. And you might say, well, that's a good thing. It's good to have a moral compass and to impose that moral compass on the world around you. But actually, you can't. You can only worry about you. And you've got to find a way to accept that not everyone's like you, but you can have your own moral compass, and you can try and keep navigating your way forward on that moral compass, but you can't allow the people who aren't like you around you to make you explode.
No. And that's so true. And I love the way that you put that about it being physics, because it's such a different way of looking at it. That you talk about the paving slabs. That's one of the things that when you're explaining it, you have like that little walnut that's there, and then you put something heavy on it, and then you put another heavy thing on it, and you continue to stack those things on it, and it eventually cracks and gets crushed. Whereas someone who hasn't had some of those heavy things put upon them, they're whole and they're going through it. So then later when they do have something heavy put on, it's not as much pressure. It doesn't crack as quickly and easily. So that's a very simple, easy way to see and understand. I love that.
I think there's a stigma, isn't there, with PTSD? There's a stigma that you're weak, that other people are fine and you seem to have cracked. And in the Second World War, that was the thing that was making the psychiatrists be puzzled. How come, Bob and Bill could go into the same battle and experience the same circumstances and the same loss, but Bob's fine and Bill's in pieces? And all the way through the Second World War, they could not understand that until John Watkins in about 1943, 1944, started to see that every single person who was really struggling had a background, a childhood that was incredibly difficult. And, we're talking about the last 100 years. Everything is so new. We think that people in the past had the same knowledge as us, the same understanding as us. And we kind of think, what's wrong with you? Why don't you understand PTSD? Why don't you realize that these people will eventually crack? But this field that we work in is so new, and we're finding new things all the time. I'm sure you find that with your clients. It's like, whoa, okay, that's a whole new toolbox I didn't have. And every person you treat gives you more information to try and pin the pieces together. And even though Freud understood that and the psychologists of his time understood that it was probably coming from childhood, they didn't correlate the fact that when someone went to war, it was related to childhood. They didn't correlate that. And a lot of people are very resistant to that idea. I remember one of my patients saying, oh, for God's sake, we're not going to talk about childhood again, are we? I went to a therapist and he wanted to know about my childhood. What the hell are you talking about my childhood for? So he just wanted to know a rough picture of how easy life had been for you. Oh, that was awful. I've got holes all over my house where I punched the walls in because I'm so angry about my dad, or I'm so angry about my mum. And I was like, and you don't think that's relevant? It's like, no, of course it's not relevant. And I think as much as our clients educate us, it's incumbent upon us to help them understand where those initial feelings may be coming from, that there is a part of them that is inside them that hasn't reconciled what happened and hasn't moved forward when they moved forward. And that part is sitting there and saying, well, are you coming back down here to sort this out? Because yes, you may have married this lovely lady and you may have these lovely 2 kids and you've got a great job now, but what about what happened? When are we going to talk about it? When are we going to address it? And of course, we're all so desperate to not go back there and address it because, it was awful, but let's just leave that, put it in the box, especially guys, shove it in that box, shove the lid on, la, 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 la. And so the voice inside has to get louder. And the interesting thing that I hadn't realized really until I really went into this practice that I've been doing for 6-7 years now is louder means physical. So you may have anxiety, you may have feelings that make you feel uncomfortable and you squash that. Then those feelings may get more and more difficult. So you don't want to drive the car, you don't want to go out, you want to stay in the house. And you squash that and think, well, I quite like staying in the house and I hated driving the car. You make up reasons as to why that's okay in your life. And then the part inside of you gets so frustrated that you're not listening, that it'll start causing physical problems in your body. So as you know, Laura, some of our clients can come to us and mentally they say they're fine, but they've got a crippling back pain that they've had for 20 years and that no doctor can explain. And they just say, oh, it's just my back, I must have carried heavy weights or I hurt it when I was 3 and this sort of thing. And then that putting 2 and 2 together, that basically this part inside of you is using whatever method it can to stop you. A case of one of our colleagues, who I think you may remember, a chap who had a very difficult childhood and was now a BMX biker. And this is an extreme example and the kind of examples that happened in war. But this young man went out on his bike. The part had decided that life had been so dangerous to that point, and now he was deliberately doing dangerous things, which is risk-taking as a part of PTSD, just to feel something. And then when he would go towards a ramp on his bike, he'd go blind. And hysterical blindness is something that was seen a lot during World War I and World War II. It's like the body's like, we don't want to see this, so we're going to just turn you blind. That's the safest way to protect you from these awful things that are happening. Or they came back mute, or they came back deaf, but there was no allopathic reason for it. And people say, well, I can't have PTSD because I wasn't in the military, or I wasn't a policeman, or I wasn't a fireman. But you have to understand that living in a very scary situation, living in a frightening, abusive situation is like going to war every day of your life. Every day of your life, you're scared. Every day of your life, you're waiting for an attack, or you're waiting for an onslaught. Even if you're being psychologically abused by somebody that you're living with, it's exactly the same in terms of the effect on the body as putting you in a war zone for 6 months, but you've been in that for 20 years. And so the body will start to do anything it can to try to insulate you. And that might be dissociation. It might be a need to escape other people and hide. It might be go deaf. I had a chap go deaf who was living with a wife who was very abusive. He just simply couldn't hear her now. So it's fascinating what the body's capable of. And we are hostage to that situation. And I say to my clients when they come in, let's forget mental illness. I hate the term mental illness. It's just maybe because I'm not really a therapist, but I hate it because it's not an illness. It's life and dealing with. And secondly, it's physics, i.e. how much weight can we put on you till you crack? And then on top of that, your body has got you hostage, and we now need to enter a hostage negotiation where we find out what's upsetting your body, and then we can start working on compromise solutions that your body's willing to accept to allow you to go forward. And that part inside of you, that's real. It's not a voice in your head that makes you feel like you're going insane. It's a real part of you, and we need to deal with that. So I call my practice hostage negotiation meets couples counselling, because we have to find a compromise.
Very true. Oh my gosh, so true. And one of the things, and that was very surprising to me in the process of learning with you, but it makes total sense. is that when you talk about some of the predispositions for later experiencing the trauma that comes, the PTSD, whatever you want to label it as, the difficulties, you don't think about as you grow up that was actually a trauma. It could be something when you were tiny that your tiny person was traumatized by, that you're not going to be traumatized by today, but it was very much so that way. And you've shared some great stories about some of that, but even having a premature birth, that is very traumatizing for that baby. If you think about it, that's a big deal. And that can create one of those predispositions. I love the story. It astounded me, and I share it with other people often about the gentleman who had the stutter. And because when he was tiny, a little person, I don't even remember, he was 2 or 3 or barely.
Just over 1, just walking. Basically, a chap had a stutter, came in, we sat down to talk about it. Obviously, a stutter is indicative of anxiety, and which just makes sense. Just looking at it, even if you didn't know anything about psychology, somebody at some point has made that person nervous so that they're unable to get their words out. And he accepted that he was quite an anxious person. And we went back through all these different things that might have caused a stutter. And we took him into hypnosis. We asked his body to show him what might be the reason for stuttering, and it would show him all these different things. But when he came out of hypnosis, he was still stuttering. And this is important. If the symptom is still there when you come out of hypnosis, it doesn't mean it hasn't worked. What it means is that you have not yet found the root cause. So you can imagine it like a string of fairy lights where something happened, as Laura's saying, way, way, way back. And then other things happen to you, which then build on the initial feeling that you had when that first thing happened. So we went down his string of fairy lights, which was an analogy given to me by a patient who saw the fairy lights in his own session. And we went down those string of fairy lights and we kept going, session 4, session 5. So if you're in therapy, keep going unless it totally dissipates and you suddenly feel a eureka moment. Keep going and don't feel that your therapist is no good at what they're doing, because any therapist can only go as fast or as quickly as your body is willing to show you what was wrong, because it's so worried about you that you're so upset all the time that sometimes it will show you things off to the side which weren't actually the most important thing. But it's like, there you go, that's it. And you're like, no, it's not that. I can still feel it. So this chap could still feel this issue with stuttering. And I think it was about the 5th or 6th session. I asked again, I tried different routes in like you do, Laura. And at the end, I asked again, could you please show him what caused these feelings in him and this stutter? And he said, oh, my Lord, I saw me as a tiny baby and I was running into the kitchen and I was just walking. And he said, and as I ran into the kitchen, I tripped over my fire engine and I grabbed the tablecloth to stop my fall. But his mother had just baked a birthday cake for his dad and had put it on the table. And so as he pulled the tablecloth, the cake went everywhere. Obviously, Mum turns round and, having never berated her baby before, anything like that, starts going, oh my God, bad baby, why would you do that? Thinking that he's walked up to the table and done it on purpose. And he said, I felt this unbelievable need to explain to her, I didn't do it on purpose. I came in the room, I fell over my car, I didn't mean to do it. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. He said, but I couldn't speak. I was only like 18 months old and I couldn't get any words out. And she was like, oh, what the hell am I going to do? Be home in 2 hours. There's no birthday cake. Just as we as parents would have had that outburst. Not ever in a million years thinking that outburst was traumatizing the baby, was upsetting the baby. You think, it's a baby. What does it know? It doesn't know anything. Mummy's running around the kitchen, it's not relevant to me. And I think this has taught me that we are compos mentis as fully formed emotional people, as tiny babies. So this chap internalized this almost fear of his mother for the first time in his life, being angry with him and shouting, and the fact it was his fault. And from that moment on, he had stuttered, and he went back and spoke to his mum about this incident and said, did I always stutter? Should I have, from the minute you could speak, you stuttered? Because of course this had happened before he could speak.
Right.
But from that day forward, when he came out of, what was interesting was when he came out of hypnotherapy, we were just talking about it and he's like, oh my God, it's amazing. And it took us both about 5 minutes to realise, you're not stuttering. And he's like, no, I'm not. And that was the last time he stuttered. The body needed him to understand it. The body needed, do you remember when I was so small and we were so small and we were so upset and we didn't get over it for days that Mummy had shouted at us and all this kind of thing. And the body was holding the upset and the emotion of this moment. And so even the death of a pet to a very small child. I had another lady who was having panic attacks whenever she entered a market square. And it didn't matter which market square. She'd go to France and enter a market square and she'd have a panic attack. But she was fine if she wasn't in the square. And she lived in a market town in the UK, so she had to avoid the market square, which obviously is a problem in your life if you're living in that town. And when she went back, she found that she had got lost in a market square when she was 3. And a kind lady had picked her up and tried to find her parents, couldn't find them. So the lady thought, well, the best thing I can do is take the child home. Maybe they've gone home without the baby, not realising. So I'll take the child home and call the police. So she took the child home and was giving it a biscuit and a drink or whatever. And every time the baby in hypnosis, this woman remembered saying, where's my parents? Where's my parents? And she said, oh, don't worry about that. You're fine here. You're perfectly safe here. And so the young baby believed they'd been kidnapped. And she had called the police, but the baby had no concept that she'd called the police. And the police were trying to find the parents and were saying, can you hold on to the baby for the moment? The woman's like, yeah, no problem. I'll look after it. If you can send someone out around town, try and find the parents. And for about 2 hours, this child thought they'd been kidnapped. And eventually they were reunited. But the trauma of those 2 hours was enough to keep this woman out of a marketplace for the rest of her life.
That's the part right there that if you experience that now, as an adult or even as an older child or something, you would have understood. It would have been a different situation. You would have handled the cake situation differently. You would have handled having help from someone that you didn't know totally differently.
It's resources at the time.
Yeah.
Some people are scared to do hypnotherapy because they're like, what am I going to find out? I'm going to find out some awful thing happened to me that I don't know about. And because as a therapist, you're saying there may be repressed memories, and the repressed memories may be the reason that you're feeling this way. And so I'd never realized before that scares patients to hell, because they're like, what repressed memory do I have? I don't want to. I stopped saying it like that and started saying, it's all a learning curve. I started saying, it may be something that would traumatize a 2-year-old or traumatize a 3-year-old. May even just be, the fact that your parents split up and you think you don't remember any of it, but you remember every single second of every row. I think why hypnotherapy is so successful, because when you go back in your own mind, like you're in a dream state, and you go back to the first time you were ever upset, the first time you were ever discombobulated and didn't know what to do because you had no resources, you can't even run away, you can't walk. That allows you to see it through the eyes of you at that age. And then as a 35-year-old adult or a 45-year-old adult, you're like, oh, well, that wasn't actually that upsetting. Sometimes, of course, it is in the case of abuse and child abuse. But, in some circumstances, these are things that have plagued our entire life. We have no idea why. No one else in any of the medical services has ever been able to give you a reason as to why you feel that way, and everyone in your family doesn't. And that's also important, I think, that I've realized over the course of my time, the way you reacted to the first fear, the first upset, is the way you will always react. And it creates the symptoms that you will experience.
All right, Change Gang, it's not the end of the conversation, but I had to split this into 2. So I hope you meet me right here next week to finish this conversation up. In the meantime, you can find Sarah at thebeatretreat.com. Thebeatretreat.com. It'll be listed in the show notes, so go have a look. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great week ahead. I hope today's episode was interesting and helpful to you in some way. If so, find someone to share it with. Maybe it will help them too. If you'd like to know more about anything discussed here today, you can find all the places to connect with me and the guest speakers in the show notes. Or go to lauraordile.com
LAURAORDILE.com, and you can reach out to me there. Until next time, ask when you need help, be kind to yourself, and have a happy day.